They're incredibly prolific. I don't know how they do it. Daniel and Robert can, write articles, multiple articles every day, 7 days a week. So thank you both for being here, and thank you for everything you do for the center. As I mentioned, Robert is the director of Jihad Watch and a Schumann Fellow. He's the author of 29 books. The book that he's here to just talk about tonight is the 29th book. And I want to, just a quick aside, C-SPAN is here. We've been at C-SPAN a long time. We're honored to have them come. They're going to be covering Robert's talk about his new book. The reason why I mention that, other than plugging C-SPAN, is when we do the Q&A, we have a standing mic over there. So if anyone has a question, I'm going to ask everyone to make a line at the microphone. We won't end up walking around with the mic. It's much easier for the coverage, for film coverage, to have people standing at the mic. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Robert has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the United States Army Command, and General Staff College. He's spoken to the Justice Department and a number of government offices. I put an asterisk by this because Robert has not been invited in recent years to speak to these departments, but hopefully with the new sheriff in town at Washington, D.C., we're hoping that Robert will be invited again to speak for the FBI on terrorism, Central Command, and all of those departments. He's a regular columnist with PJ Media, and of course, as I mentioned, Front Page Mag. He's written hundreds of articles. He's appeared on BBC, Fox News, CNN, a number of networks. Robert is incredibly prolific with the media. He's been a featured speaker, I don't know, Robert, at least 100 public canvases. He was supposed to speak at UCLA. I think that was just last year, maybe a year and a half ago. They had to cancel the talk because they were worried about it was okay for the pro-Palestinians to basically take over the campus grounds, but they couldn't stand to have Robert Spencer speak on campus. So they canceled that, really, I think that afternoon when he was supposed to speak. In fact, I think Robert was either there or on his way to UCLA. UCLA, no surprise, got cold feet and canceled Robert Spencer. We will never cancel Robert Spencer to speak for free. Robert's books have been translated, I have to mention this, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Finnish, Korean, Polish, Portuguese, and Bahasa Indonesia. I don't know what that means. Maybe Robert can tell us what Bahasa Indonesia is. Okay, so a couple of quotes. What do others say about Robert? Oriana Fallaci, who's a personal hero of mine, as Robert is a hero of mine. Oriana says, my comrade in arms, my pal, my buddy. Well, if you're Oriana Fallaci's buddy, you're in pretty good company. I am Hershey Ali writes, no one has upset the Islamophobia cabal more than Robert Spencer. First, he knows more about Islamic doctrine than they do. How true is that? Next, he has outed all the tricks that they use in their bag to disinform the public. Finally, most importantly, Robert will not be cowed. And I can say this, when I talk about Robert being a hero, he's just been had multiple death threats throughout the 20 years that I've known Robert. He's been poisoned. He was poisoned in Iceland at one time. He's been attacked. Robert comes under daily threats, and yet he perseveres. He cannot be cowed, and he really is. Maybe we'll give a presidential the medal to Robert Spencer. And I love that. I don't have the book in front of me. If you've got the book, Dennis Prager wrote saying that this is the best book on anti-Semitism ever written. That is really high praise for Dennis Prager. But there are some negatives. This is a quote from an associate professor at Boston University. Robert is the grand poobah of the legend of American Islamophobes. So, if you remember, I don't know, people are all old enough to remember the Flintstones, but the grand poobah was the Flintstones movies. Robert remembers. Satanic ignoramus. That's Hail Muhammad. Newspaper in Saudi Arabia said he's the Likud Antichrist. That's pretty serious. And then finally, one of the Al-Qaeda representatives called him the Zionist crusader, missionary of hate, and a counter-Islam consultant. So I'm very proud of him. He's here in the 60s. He's going to talk about his new book on anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert.
In any case, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mike, for that very generous introduction. And the occasion is indeed the book Anti-Semitism, History and Myth, which is just out. And I wanted to explain first off that I wrote this because after October 7th, I was talking to a couple of old friends separately and was quite shocked when they started to say things like, well, you know, yes, it was a terrible attack, but really what Israel is doing is far worse. And you don't hear about it because the Jews control the media. And I said, what? The Jews control, have you read the New York Times? If the Jews control the media, they're doing an awfully bad job of it. And in any case, it became clear as the weeks after October 7th unfolded that these guys were very serious about this, people I had once respected and worked with. And so I thought, if this is an indication of what's going on, and I think it is, in the United States and the West, then there needs to be an attempt at pushback, because it was astonishing to me that some of these very old anti-Semitic ideas were suddenly popping back up. And in order to understand why this is happening and what we can do about it, we have to first understand where it all comes from. And it starts really with conformism, which is a universal human tendency. And all of us, to some degree, are conformists. It's not a word that we would ever really choose for ourselves or something that we would say I'm proud of conforming. And yet, human beings do conform in all kinds of ways. We are all dressed in a certain way here tonight. And the gentlemen in the audience generally have jackets. Some have ties, as I do. And nobody's wearing a jalaba or a dashiki or something of that kind, because that's not generally what we wear in this part of the world in this day and age. It's no judgment on anybody else. It's just not how we dress. We dress this way. There's nothing wrong with that or right with how anybody else dresses. It's just the way it is. And you can take conformism and apply it to so very many things in human behavior. It's really one of the things that keeps communities together, that communities all tend to act in certain ways in the same way, eat the same sorts of foods, have the same kinds of beliefs, have the same perspectives on different things. And generally, often, those who hold different perspectives are looked down upon. And like I say, this can be something that can be very lethal, but it can be something completely innocuous. And I believe that the problem of anti-Semitism ultimately goes back to the fact that the Jews as a people have refused to conform to the larger society in every place they have been in the world where they have been a minority in a larger society. And that has been because of the particularities of the Jewish identity as being very cautiously the people called and chosen by the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, who told them that they are to be set apart. And so they have been set apart. Now, here again, this is not a judgment in any either positively or negatively at this point. It's just a statement of fact. But if you look at the four primary causes of anti-Semitism, the four chief roots of anti-Semitism, which I discuss each of them at length in the book, you'll see that ultimately what it comes down to is the refusal of the Jews to conform to a larger group among whom they live, but of which they are not part. Now, this is a necessity for survival in the first place, because all the groups that might have been minorities within those larger groups that did conform and become indistinguishable from the larger group, they disappeared from history because they became part of the larger group, which was the one thing that God told the Jews not to do. but to remain apart. And so you have in the first place Christianity. So I should say at the outset that I myself, contrary to popular belief, am not Jewish, and I am a believing Christian. At the same time, I recognize that there has been a Christian anti-Semitism, and I'm also proud of the fact that some of the major Christian leaders, the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople for the Orthodox Church, of which I'm a member, and others have repudiated Christian anti-Semitism. But it also has very deep roots and a long history that goes back, of course, to the very ancient charge that the Jews killed Christ. And of course, the concomitant charge that the Jews, just by remaining Jews and not becoming Christians, by rejecting Christ, were becoming, in a certain sense, the emblematic and foremost rejectors of this new faith. In any case, there's a fundamental incoherence in Christian anti-Semitism that I think has been far too seldom remarked upon. And that is this. In the Christian scheme of things, the idea is that Christ bears the sins of the people and redeems them from their sins. And that everybody's sins is what put Christ on the cross. If you're a Christian or you've studied Christianity at all, you know this is basic Christianity is common to Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and so on. And that everybody by sinning is contributing to putting Christ on the cross. And then Christian anti-Semites will turn around and say, but the Jews didn't, and it's their fault. And they bear a particular guilt for killing Christ. Well, if everybody's sins killed Christ, then the Jews don't bear a particular guilt for it. And if the Jews do bear a particular guilt for it, then you can't really say that it is everyone's sins who put him on the cross. And so Christian anti-Semitism, I believe, actually contradicts Christianity at its core. And this is something that has only in the latter day been recognized when the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church repudiated anti-Semitism in the 1960s, and other modern Christian leaders did so. But Christian anti-Semitism is, it ain't no stay. Maybe you had no secret.
Oh.
No. I could hold it, but that help?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
If I held it?
Yeah.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a great show for you tonight. In any case, Christian anti-Semitism, based on the idea that the Jews killed Christ, led to all manner of pogroms and persecutions, discrimination and harassment over the centuries in Europe, and ultimately came down to, up until the 20th century, the idea that if they would just convert, then everything would be okay. So you see, ultimately it comes back to convert, conform to the larger community, and everything will be fine. Which the Jews quite rightly responded, well, then we would lose our particular identity, which we were given by God, and consequently we can't do that. That's not going to work either. It is? Okay, thank you. Oh. $300, please. Anyway, so that's the Christians. It's the same thing when it comes to Islam. In Islam, Muhammad is the final prophet, and he brings the final book, the Quran, confirming what is in the Torah and the Gospel. The Torah and the Gospel being envisioned in the Quran as being the confirmation, the Torah and the Gospel rather being books that were given to Moses and Jesus respectively. Now that's not the Christian understanding, which is that the Gospel is the good news of Christ himself. But in the Islamic understanding, the Gospel is a book that Allah handed to Jesus. And he gave Moses the Torah, and he gave Muhammad the Quran. And all of their messages are the same. And then the wicked Jews and the wicked Christians rejected Muhammad and the Quran. and thus they are to be warred against and subjugated under the hegemony of Islam, so that they will, by the deprivation they suffer in this world, be made to understand the price of rejecting Allah and will repent and convert. So there again, you have, if you will just convert, everything will be okay. If you will give up your particularity and join the larger group, then everything will be okay. And there's some very prominent Jewish converts to Islam in the modern age. Adam Gadon, who, Mike, did you mention that Al-Qaeda invited me to accept Islam? Well, that was Adam Gadon. He was this kid out of Oregon, a Jewish kid who converted to Islam, and he made a video inviting me and Daniel Pipes and Steve Emerson to convert to Islam, which, you know, it was sweet of him really to think of us. The fact is that that is a prelude to killing us, because he understands that in Islamic law, first you invite the unbelievers to accept Islam, then if they refuse, you go to war against them. So he was just getting a pretext to kill us, but a drone got him first. Anyway, the thing about the Jews, though, with Islam is that it's even more problematic, because people don't realize nowadays exactly how deeply hateful toward the Jews the Islamic texts are. And there's actually even a scholar nowadays who is quite popular, and I debated him years ago at UCLA before they started canceling everybody. And he contends that there was no anti-Semitism in the Islamic world until the Nazis brought it. Now, this is completely, you have to not know anything about the Quran or Islam or Islamic history to be able to contend that. And as I show in the book, the Quran calls the Jews the worst enemies of the Muslims. It's chapter 5, verse 82. Says that Allah transformed the disobedient Jews into apes and pigs, which is obviously dehumanizing in the modern parlance. It calls upon Muslims to wage war against them. And throughout the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, they're pretty much blamed for everything, always scheming against the Muslims, always making more trouble for the Muslims. And consequently, when you look at today's state of Israel, you cannot understand that conflict unless you understand Quranic anti-Semitism, because that's the prism through which the Palestinians and their allies see it. And when they see Israel, they don't see, oh, here are these people who were persecuted and exiled for 2,000 years and they came back to their homeland. They see these are the enemies of the Muslims causing more trouble. And Allah calls us to wage war against them and drive them out from where they drove us out. And that's all in the Quran. So Islamic anti-Semitism is quite virulent. But there again, if the Jews would just convert, if they would conform to the larger society, everything would be okay. The third cause of anti-Semitism nowadays is National Socialism. I don't like to call it Nazism because it was a kind of socialism. And people obscure that. It's actually the Western left that started calling it Nazism all the time instead of National Socialism. Nazi is just an abbreviation. And Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Third Reich, he wrote a little pamphlet called Der Nazi Sozi, which meant the National Socialists. And they ultimately became known as the Nazis. But they were the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And then the fourth one is International Socialism. And National Socialism and International Socialism differ from one another only in terms of, or primarily, I should say, in terms of not that there should be socialism or not. It's not a left-right thing. They're both socialists. They both envisioned an ideal state being a welfare state with a massive government that controls everything. But in National Socialism, private enterprise remains private. It's not all nationalized. But everything is directed toward the aims of the state anyway. It's just nominally in private hands. So you don't have everyone impoverished as everyone becomes a slave of the state, but they're a slave of the state anyway. They just keep a little bit more of their money and nominal ownership over the means of production. But the National Socialists were and are a race-based idea with the Jews as the evil race. Now, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer, he said in the 20th century that the dividing line, we have to remember, and it's all too easy to forget, that the dividing line between good and evil does not run between one group of people and another. It runs down the middle of every human heart. Everybody is capable of good and everybody is capable of evil. And that being the case, Solzhenitsyn would say, if he were consistent, which he wasn't always, that anti-Semitism would have to be ruled out. But the Nazis, the National Socialists, made it the basis of their thought that there was one race that was pure, the Aryans, so-called, and one race that was completely tainted and was as evil as they were portrayed in Islamic anti-Semitism, and that was the Jews. International socialism is almost identical to that, communism, although it's not understood. Just like Islam, people don't generally understand it as anti-Semitic. And a lot of times when you read anti-Semitic literature, as I did an awful lot in researching this book, you see very common people saying, well, the early Bolsheviks, they were all Jews. And you can look and see, yeah, Trotsky, well, there must have been a few others. Yeah, there were a few others, but Lenin was not Jewish. Stalin was not Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. It was not a Jewish movement. Actually, international socialism, it's ironic that people identify it with Judaism and Jews, the anti-Semites do anyway, because Marx himself wrote that the Jews are equal to capitalists, that they are the quintessential capitalists, and identified them 100% with finance capital, and consequently said, in order to establish the workers' paradise and true communism, the Jews have to be eliminated. Now, he did not necessarily mean all murdered. He meant conforming to the larger collective. They give up all the distinctives of being Jewish and become communists without any particular practices or particular outlook. And this was absolutely necessary because he identified them so strongly with capitalism. So in all four cases, you see, it's always the Jews are identified as the unassimilable group that will not conform to the larger group and thus has to be eliminated in one way or another. Now, nowadays, we see a tremendous recrudescence of all four of these. And I was dismayed as an Orthodox Christian to see, if you go on Twitter, the largest, most influential voices with the most followers among Orthodox Christians are furiously anti-Semitic, posting photos of Hitler. And I mean, it's just outrageous. And there's that. There is Islamic anti-Semitism, of course, that we see all over after October 7th, with the pro-Hamas protesters in the United States demonstrating outside Jewish businesses, outside Jewish-owned establishments that have nothing to do with Israel or Zionism. It just happens that the person running them is Jewish. And that's enough, because it's really the Jews that they're after, and the idea that they're just fighting Zionists is a fig leaf. And then you have National Socialism reoccurring with people as prominent as Tucker Carlson platforming this historian who, Darrell Cooper, who was actually repeating talking points from Hitler's regime in demonizing Churchill and saying that he just wanted to, that Hitler wanted to unify Europe against the capitalists. There again, he was a socialist, against the capitalists in Britain who were bleeding Europe dry for their own economic purposes and so on, and minimizing the Holocaust, saying that it was just a matter of the German gains in Russia being so great that they didn't have places to keep all the prisoners, and so the prisoners started starving to death. And all these things, those are things the Nazis actually said, the National Socialists actually said at the time. And so you have that coming back. And then, of course, you have the left anti-Semitism that may be the largest at this point.